I was cutting into my salmon when the woman at the next table leaned toward her daughter and said it loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. Like mother, like daughter. What did anyone expect? She didn't lower her voice. She didn't bother. People like her never do, because for her entire life, no one had ever made her feel like she needed to. I set my fork down very slowly. My hands were steady, which surprised me, because my heart was doing something violent behind my ribs. I knew that voice. I had been hearing it in some form or another for 11 years. At parent-teacher conferences, at school fundraisers, in the parking lot of the firm where I had worked myself half to death for a decade. The woman's name was Constance Whitfield. Her daughter Brianna was sitting across from her in a cream cashmere sweater, smiling into her wine glass like the whole thing was enormously funny. And the daughter they were talking about, the janitor's child, the charity case, the cautionary tale, was me. My name is Elena Marsh. 11 months ago, I was a senior partner at Whitfield & Crane Legal Associates. I had built that career from nothing, from a childhood spent watching my mother mop floors in office buildings at 5 in the morning, from scholarships and night shifts, and years of making myself small so that people like Constance Whitfield wouldn't feel threatened by how fast I was rising. I had a reputation that took a decade to build, and in one carefully orchestrated afternoon, they had tried to take it from me. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, sitting at that restaurant table with their chilled Chablis and their comfortable cruelty, was that I had kept every email, every document, every voicemail, and I was no longer the woman who stayed quiet. But I should start at the beginning. Not the screaming, spectacular beginning they probably expected from someone like me, the quiet one. The one that smelled like fresh coffee and sounded like ordinary life. My apartment on Aldermere Street had a particular kind of morning light that I had come to think of as mine. It came through the east-facing kitchen window at a low, generous angle between 7 and 8, turning everything honey-colored. The butcher block countertop, the worn spines of the law books I kept stacked by the coffee maker, the framed photograph of my mother in her work uniform that I had placed deliberately on the highest shelf, where I could see it from every corner of the room. I made coffee the slow way, with a pour-over and a timer, because the ritual of it steadied me before the day began. I had learned that discipline early. You don't grow up the way I grew up, watching your mother leave the house before dawn and return after dark, carrying a tiredness that sat in her bones, without understanding that steadiness is the only luxury that cannot be taken from you. I had been at Whitfield & Crane for a decade by the time any of this happened. I had joined as a junior associate at 26, fresh out of law school on a merit scholarship, and I had spent the first 3 years quietly outworking everyone in the room. I billed more hours than the partners expected. I never missed a deadline. I did the unglamorous work, the due diligence, the contract reviews, the late-night calls with anxious clients, without complaint, because I understood something about institutional memory. The people who do the invisible work are eventually the people who cannot be replaced. My mentor at the firm, a semi-retired partner named David Crane, had taken notice early. "You think 3 moves ahead," he told me once, after I had flagged a contractual ambiguity that would have cost a client $400,000. "Most people here think 1 move ahead, and they call themselves strategists." I had smiled at my desk and gone back to work. By year 5, I was handling my own clients. By year 7, I was generating more revenue than 3 of the named partners combined. By year 9, I was the most profitable associate the firm had ever had, and the partnership offer was a formality that everyone, including me, assumed was coming. It was Constance Whitfield who had other ideas. Constance was one of the founding partners, which meant her name was on the door and her word carried the weight of institutional tradition. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair she wore in a severe chignon, and a wardrobe that communicated a very specific message. I have always been this kind of woman, and you have always been that kind of woman, and we both know the difference. She had been politely dismissive of me for years, in the way that certain powerful women are dismissive of women who rose differently. Women who had not attended the right schools, or grown up in the right neighborhoods, or been coached by the right families in the art of appearing effortlessly capable. She never said anything overtly cruel. She didn't need to. The raised eyebrow at the partnership meeting when I proposed a new client strategy. The way she would address my male colleagues by their first names and refer to me, always, as Miss Marsh. The extra syllable of formality, a reminder that I had not yet been fully admitted into the room. Small calibrations, carefully maintained. The kind of treatment you can't report because each individual instance is too minor to name. What I didn't know, what I had been too busy working to notice, was that Constance had a plan. And her daughter Brianna, who had recently joined the firm as an associate with a resume that would not have cleared my original interview threshold, was the plan's primary beneficiary. The first sign came on a Tuesday in early November, when I arrived at the office to find that 3 of my major clients had received letters on firm letterhead signed by Constance, informing them that their accounts were being restructured and transferred to a new senior associate for continuity and fresh strategic perspective. The new associate was Brianna Whitfield. I read those letters standing at the front desk, still in my coat, and the blood drained from my face so quickly that one of the receptionists asked if I needed to sit down. I didn't sit down. I walked directly to Constance's office and knocked on her open door. She looked up from her desk with an expression of polished serenity that told me she had been waiting for this moment. "Elena," she said, first name suddenly, which was itself a signal. "I was going to call you in this afternoon. Please, sit down." I sat. She folded her hands on her desk in the manner of someone who has rehearsed the gesture. "The firm is going through a realignment," she said. "We feel that certain client relationships have become overly dependent on individual personalities rather than the firm as an institution. It's not personal." She delivered the last sentence with the specific gentleness reserved for things that are entirely personal. I asked her directly which partners had been consulted. She named 2, both men who owed their current positions largely to her patronage, and who had, I now realized, stopped making eye contact with me in the corridors for the past 3 weeks. I asked whether David Crane had been informed. A small pause, the first crack in her composure. "David is semi-retired," she said. "His input is valued, but operational decisions rest with the managing partners." I asked whether this restructuring applied to other associates or only to my client portfolio. Another pause. "We're addressing specific areas of concern," she said, and I understood then that we had reached the edge of what she was willing to say in this particular conversation. I stood up and thanked her for her time. I walked back to my office, closed the door, and sat very still for approximately 4 minutes, listening to the hum of the ventilation system and the muffled sounds of the office going about its ordinary business around me. Then I opened my laptop, created a new encrypted folder, and began to document everything I could remember from the past 6 months. Every interaction, every email, every instance where my work had been attributed to other people, every meeting where I had been excluded. I had a feeling, the way you sometimes have a feeling about a storm before the sky shows any sign of it, that this was not the end of what they intended to do. It was the beginning. I was right. 3 weeks later, a rumor appeared, the kind of rumor that travels through a firm's internal ecosystem with the speed and specificity of something that was deliberately released. The rumor was that I had mishandled client funds. Not stolen them, no one said that word, because saying that word creates a legal liability. The suggestion was softer, more deniable, that there had been irregularities in billing records associated with my accounts, that a client had raised concerns, that the matter was under internal review. The client in question, I would later discover, was one who had been transferred to Brianna 3 weeks prior. The irregularities were in billing records that had been altered after the transfer, in a folder I no longer had access to. I found out about the rumor from my assistant Priya, who told me with the expression of someone delivering a diagnosis. She had overheard it in the break room. By that afternoon, it had reached 2 of my remaining clients, who called my direct line with politely urgent questions. I answered those calls with calm and precise language, and then I hung up and stood at my office window for a long time, looking out at the November street below, watching people move through the cold with their coats pulled tight and their faces turned down. My mother had walked streets like that for 30 years. She had mopped the floors of buildings like the one I was standing in, and she had done it with a grace and a quiet dignity that I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove was not wasted on her daughter. The thought of those billing records, altered, falsified, bearing the ghost of my name, made something go very cold and very clear inside my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something more useful than anger, a kind of absolute determination that settles in like winter. I called David Crane that evening from my apartment. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting my call. "I've heard," he said, before I could speak. His voice was careful and tired in a way that told me the situation was more advanced than I had known. "How long?" I asked. A pause that lasted slightly too long. "Elena," he said, "I want you to understand that I tried to intervene. 3 weeks ago, when Constance first presented this to the managing committee, I made my objections very clear." I asked him what the managing committee had discussed 3 weeks ago. Another pause. "There is a document," he said slowly, "that I think you need to see. Not over the phone. Can you come tomorrow morning? Early, before the office opens. My home office." I said yes. I stayed up most of that night at my kitchen table, the morning light hours away, the photograph of my mother looking down at me from the high shelf. I made another pot of coffee, and I thought about every small thing I had let slide over the years. Every raised eyebrow I had absorbed and filed away. Every time I had told myself that performing excellence was enough protection against whatever they might try. My mother had worked for 30 years in buildings where she was invisible, and she had taught me by example that invisibility is not safety. She had also taught me, in the way that mothers teach their children the most important things, not through words but through the way they move through the world, that the moment you stop being invisible is the moment you find out exactly who the people around you are. I had stopped being invisible years ago. I had just been too busy building to watch what it revealed. The morning I drove to David Crane's home office was one of those November mornings that feels like an argument. Gray sky pressing low over the city, a cold that found every gap in your coat, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been submerged in water. I had barely slept. I had spent the hours between 2 and 5 sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad, writing out a timeline of everything I could recall from the past 8 months. Dates, conversations, the names of clients who had been contacted, the specific language Constance had used in meetings. My handwriting was steadier than I expected. Adrenaline, I suppose, has its own kind of clarity. David lived in a house in the older part of the city, where the streets were lined with oak trees and the houses had been built when people still believed in front porches. His wife let me in with a look of careful sympathy that told me she knew at least the broad shape of what was happening. David was in his study at the back of the house, a room that smelled of old paper and the particular wool and cedar smell of a man who has spent 40 years building something he believed in. He was standing at his desk when I came in, not sitting, which I noticed. He had a manila folder in his hand. He set it on the desk between us without speaking first, and I understood from the way he did it, gently, with both hands like something fragile, that whatever was in it was going to change the shape of what I understood. I opened the folder. Inside was a printed copy of an internal memo dated 8 weeks prior, addressed to the managing committee and signed by Constance Whitfield. The subject line read, "Restructuring of Associate Portfolio, Risk Mitigation." I read the first paragraph. Then I read it again. Then I set the paper down on the desk and looked at David Crane because I needed something stable to look at. The memo did not use my name in the first section. It referred to the associate in question and described a pattern of client boundary issues, unverifiable billing practices and concerning patterns of financial record management that had apparently been flagged during routine audit procedures. By the third paragraph, my name appeared. By the fourth paragraph, the document recommended my immediate removal from client-facing responsibilities, pending a formal internal investigation. The fifth paragraph recommended that the partnership offer, currently under consideration, be indefinitely tabled. I heard a sound in the room that I didn't immediately recognize as coming from me. Not a cry, something quieter than that, and in some ways worse. A small, controlled exhale that I had to make deliberately to keep my hands from shaking. "The audit," I said. My voice was very flat. "There was no audit. I wasn't informed of any audit." David sat down slowly. "No," he said, "there wasn't." He pressed his hands together on the desk in front of him, the gesture of a man choosing his words with the care of someone who knows they can't be taken back. "Elena, I want you to know that I went to the managing committee the morning I received this memo. I told them this was retaliatory, that there was no evidentiary basis for any of these claims, and that proceeding on this basis constituted a serious legal exposure for the firm." I asked what the committee had said. He was quiet for a moment. "They said that Constance had documentation," he said. "Billing records, with your signature." Another pause, longer this time. "I have reason to believe those records were altered after the client transfers, but proving that will require an independent forensic review of the firm's billing system, and Constance has already moved to restrict access." I looked at the memo again. I looked at the date on it. 8 weeks ago, which meant that the first time Constance had called me into her office and spoken about realignment, she had already circulated this document to the managing committee. The client transfers had not been a preliminary move. They had been the final move in a plan that had been running for months before I was ever informed. Every conversation I had replayed in my memory now rearranged itself. Brianna's quiet smile at the coffee machine, the new keycard reader installed outside the billing department, the way the two junior partners had stopped meeting my eyes. None of it had been coincidental. "How long have you known about this?" I asked David. He held my gaze without flinching, which I respected. 6 weeks, he said. "I've been trying to find a way to intervene that wouldn't destroy the firm's ability to function. I was wrong to wait. I'm sorry." I accepted the apology by not giving him the easy absolution of saying it didn't matter, because it did matter. But I also understood that he was the only ally I had left inside that building, and that the conversation we were having was itself a kind of evidence, a record that needed to be handled carefully. I took photographs of the memo on my phone. I thanked David and drove back across the city in the gray November light, and I sat in my car outside my apartment building for 20 minutes because I needed that time to let the full scale of what I was facing settle into something I could work with. Constance had been building this for at least 2 months before I noticed. She had the managing committee, she had access to the billing system, she had her daughter positioned to absorb my clients the moment I was removed. What she did not have, what she could not have had, because she had spent 11 years looking at me and seeing a janitor's daughter who cleaned up nicely, was an understanding of what I was actually capable of when someone took something from me that I had built with my own hands. She had made the mistake that people like her always make about people like me. She had assumed that because I had been patient, I could not be dangerous. I was very dangerous. I just needed 3 things: time, documentation, and the right person on the outside. I called my college roommate, Jess, who had spent the past decade building an employment law practice on the other side of the state. I gave her a precise 20-minute summary of everything, reading from my legal pad, keeping my voice professional and sequential. When I finished, there was a brief silence on the line. "Okay," Jess said, "you know what you have here? You have a textbook case of pretextual termination, or pre-termination, which is actually better for us because they haven't fired you yet. You also potentially have document falsification, which is a criminal matter separate from the civil claim. What I need from you is a complete record of your original billing entries, any system metadata you can recover, and the names of every client who received those transfer letters. I told her I had most of it. Of course you do, she said, with a dryness that was the closest thing to comfort I'd felt in days. You've been keeping records for years. You knew this was coming, even if you didn't know when. She was right. I had always known, in the way that you know things you don't let yourself say out loud, that the day would come when being excellent would not be sufficient protection. I had built my record of documentation not out of paranoia, but out of the quiet, clear-eyed understanding that the house I was building my career in had been designed by people who had not intended it for me. The foundation was excellent, the craftsmanship was mine, but the deed was in someone else's name, and that someone had finally decided to remind me of it. What happened next took 4 weeks and moved on multiple fronts simultaneously. Jess filed a formal preservation notice with the firm, requiring them to maintain all billing records and communications in their original state, pending potential litigation. The notice arrived on a Tuesday, and I know from what David told me later that Constance received it in a partners meeting and did not react visibly, which told him she had been expecting it. What she had not been expecting was the second notice, which Jess filed with the State Bar's Ethics Committee, citing specific concerns about the integrity of the firm's internal review process and the potential falsification of client billing records by a named partner. That notice was not something that could be managed quietly. Ethics Committee inquiries are not internal matters. They have their own investigators, their own timeline, and their own entirely separate chain of authority, one that Constance's relationships with the managing committee did nothing to influence. The forensic review of the billing system, obtained through the litigation discovery process, took 18 days. The results were not ambiguous. The altered records bore metadata timestamps from a date 3 weeks after the original billing entries had been created, 3 weeks after the client transfers, when I no longer had system access. The alterations had been made from a terminal registered to the billing department, which Brianna Whitfield had been granted elevated access to on the day of her promotion to senior associate. The forensic analyst's report used careful, technical language, but the meaning was very plain. Someone had gone into those records after the fact and changed them, and the digital trail led directly to a workstation Brianna had used. I learned this on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in Jess's office, reading the report on her screen. I didn't celebrate. I sat with it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. The vindication, yes, but underneath that something heavier and more complicated. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not ambition gone sideways or institutional carelessness. This had been a deliberate, coordinated effort to destroy something I had spent a decade building, carried out by a woman who had looked me in the face and said, "It's not personal," while signing her name to a document designed to end my career. The fact that she had failed did not make the attempt smaller. It made it more important to understand. I didn't call Constance. I didn't email the managing committee. I let Jess handle the legal mechanics with the precision they required, and I went home and I called my mother. My mother had retired 2 years prior, after 32 years of cleaning office buildings. She lived now in a small house with a garden, which she tended with the same thoroughness she had brought to everything else in her life. I told her the broad shape of what had happened and what was about to happen. She listened without interrupting, which was her way. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I had heard her say before, in different words, many times throughout my life. People who build things for you to stand on don't get to decide when you sit down. It wasn't a complicated philosophy, but from a woman who had spent 30 years making other people's spaces clean so that her daughter could build a career in them, it was everything. The settlement negotiation took 6 days. Constance's personal attorney arrived at the first meeting with what I can only describe as the particular confidence of someone who does not yet understand the nature of the ground beneath their feet. By the end of the second meeting, after Jess had presented the forensic report, the ethics committee preliminary findings, and a detailed litigation timeline that included discovery requests targeting Constance's personal communications with the managing committee, that confidence had been replaced with something much quieter. The settlement included a complete withdrawal of all allegations against me, a written acknowledgement, drafted carefully, legally binding, that my billing records contained no irregularities, full reinstatement of my partnership track with the 12-month fast-track timeline, and a financial settlement that I will not quantify here, except to say that it covered every hour of the professional damage with significant additional consideration. Brianna was placed on indefinite administrative leave pending the Bar Association's review of her role in the record alteration. Constance tendered her resignation from the managing committee 4 days after the settlement was signed. Her name remained on the door because removing it would have required a full partnership vote and a disclosure process that the firm's remaining partners were eager to avoid. But the door it was on led to an office she rarely occupied after that. I returned to my work, not with the quiet, careful tread of someone who has survived something and is grateful simply to still be standing, with a different kind of presence, one that David Crane noticed on my first week back when he stopped by my office and said simply, "Good," and closed the door behind him. I had always been excellent at this work. I was still excellent at it, but I was no longer performing the excellence for anyone else's benefit. I was doing it because it was mine, and because it had always been mine, and because no amount of manufactured irregularities or altered timestamps could change what was actually in the record of what I had built. Which brings me back to the restaurant, to Constance's voice carrying across the room with its practiced, carrying clarity, to Brianna's smile over her wine glass, to the salmon cooling on my plate. I set down my fork, as I said. I picked up my water glass and I took a sip, slowly, because the pause was important. Then I turned to face their table. Constance met my eyes with an expression that moved through several registers very quickly. Surprise, then recalibration, then the settling of her features into the particular mask of composure she had worn in every difficult moment I had ever witnessed her navigate. "Elena," she said. Just the name, no Miss Marsh this time. I noticed the change. "Good evening, Constance," I said. My voice was very pleasant and very level. "Brianna?" Brianna's smile had gone. She was looking at her mother with a flicker of something that might have been nervousness. "We were just," Constance began. "I heard what you were just," I said, still pleasantly. "The acoustics in here are excellent." A beat of silence. 2. Constance's hands on the table were very still. "I hope your evening is going well," I continued. "It's a beautiful restaurant. My firm uses it for client dinners fairly often. I'm sure you know it." Another pause. I picked up my fork and returned to my salmon. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Every person at the surrounding tables who had heard Constance's remark, and several of them clearly had, judging by the quality of the attention that had quietly shifted toward our interaction, had now also witnessed the exchange that followed it. The calibration of power in that moment was not lost on any of them. It was not lost on Constance either. She and Brianna left 20 minutes later, before dessert. I stayed for the full meal. There is a specific kind of silence that settles into a life after the loudest thing that was ever done to you has been answered. Not emptiness, something fuller than that. I know what it is now, months later, sitting on the small balcony of my apartment on Aldermere Street in the early mornings with my coffee, watching the light come in at its honey-colored, generous angle and fall across the butcher block and the law books and the photograph of my mother on the high shelf. I know it is the sound of a life that belongs entirely to yourself. My mother worked 30 years in buildings where she was invisible, and she raised a daughter who would not be. She gave me the most useful thing a parent can give a child, not money, not connections, not the right name on the door. She gave me the knowledge that the work is real, and the work is yours, And no one, not the woman with the silver chignon and the name on the letterhead, not the daughter with the wine glass and the borrowed access card, not any architect of any quiet, carefully built destruction can take from you what you built with your own hands. You carry it with you when you leave, and when you come back, it is still there, waiting, exactly as you left it, exactly as it always was. Yours.